Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I was kind of wrecked with a head cold all week, so no running for me, which only served to exacerbate the anxiety I'm having over a bunch of work stuff, which overall means I'm glad to get a little respite and post a new episode of the show. I recorded an episode this weekend for a show that I'll post in November, and that was a lot of fun, in part because the guest was staying at a hotel near Penn Station, and since it was New York Comic-Con weekend, I saw a ton of cosplaying attendees pretty much from the time I got on the subway up on 96th Street. Once I got out at 33rd, walking down the street, there were a bazillion Avengers and Spider-Men and Fantastic Fours, etc., which was all kind of neat because of, my childhood. I also managed to bump into the cartoonist I spent the most time with the weekend before at Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, Patrick McDonnell, the cartoonist who does Mutts, and we're going to get together probably this fall or winter to do a follow-up. Patrick was just walking down the sidewalk on 33rd while I was checking out the lobby of my guest's hotel, so I hustled out, shot the breeze with him for another block or so, and it was a fun coincidence. Now, I met this week's guest at a comics festival, which is different than a Comic-Con, as I tried to explain to those NYU students last week, a few years ago. It was Small Press Expo, and her name is Kate Lacour, and she makes some of the weirdest comics that I've ever come across. And they were recently collected by Fantagraphics in a book called Vivisectionary, with the subtitle, A Convocation of Biological Art. Kate's main body of work, what's in Vivisectionary, isn't panel-to-panel storytelling. It's more a sort of series of diagrams in a textbook about mutant or mutating bodies. In the books afterward, Kate writes about dioramas she saw in a museum as a kid and how her work tries to capture some of what really grabbed her about the artificial and the natural, those dead alive tableau in her watercolors and ink that she uses for these drawings. Her art is sexual and visceral and funny and grotesque. It gets labeled as body horror, but I think that's too limiting a term, and it gives too much, I think, to the narrative aspects of things, where this is much more meta-narrative. It's funny when I think about it. I mentioned Cronenberg during the episode, during the conversation, but only in relation to the absolutely enormous insects in Louisiana that she had no idea she was in for when she and her husband moved down to New Orleans. I realize now I should have cited Dead Ringers at some point, the movie Cronenberg did early on about the insane twin gynecologists, both played by Jeremy Irons, where one of them goes nuts and makes a series of instruments for operating on mutant women, which is one of the more horrifying things you see in the movie. Kate's work can have that same unsettling but weirdly compelling impulse or warring set of impulses. All of which is to say, Vivisectionary is a really compelling work. Maybe not for everybody, definitely not for kids, as we talk about, but what she does in this collection is just, well, it's mind-blowing. As caveats go, we recorded this at Cartoon Crossroads Columbus. It was in my hotel room, so there's the hotel AC that I filtered out. Also, This is a more conversational episode than some of the other ones. As I mentioned, Kate and I have talked a bunch over the years. I met her, maybe 5 or 6 years ago at Small Press Expo and followed her work all this time in mini comics. And she listens to the show, and she's a curious person. So we came into this conversation with more history of give and take than I have with other guests. So we talked together a bunch more. Now here's Kate's bio from Vivisectionary. Kate Lacour studied biology and psychology at the University of Chicago and Oberlin, and art therapy at the School of Visual Arts. She learned to draw through the Art Students League in New York City. She is the founder of NOLA Arts Learning Center, a nonprofit serving young people with diverse abilities, and delivered a TED Talk on autism, inclusion, and Mardi Gras. Her art and comics are inspired by a love for the aesthetics of science and a fascination/revulsion towards bodies. She is the winner of the 2016 Museum of Comics and Cartoon Art Award and has given art talks at the Society of Illustrators, American Art Therapy Conference, New Orleans Public Library, Antenna Gallery, Signals, and the Pharmacy Museum. Kate lives in New Orleans with her husband and 3 children. Her new book is Vivisectionary, published by Fantagraphics. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Kate Lacour. The meta theme of this show, which you know, and which I guess we'll launch into as a question, is transformation and metamorphosis.
Yeah.
How does that play out in your work? What is transformation and change to you?
Ooh, that's a broad question.
I know, but I figured we'd start with something like that. Since you're used to all the usual questions I have, since you actually listen to the show, I thought I'd throw you a curveball to start. Because the drawings aren't static.
No, that's definitely the single theme that my work always covers is transformation. And it can be like transcendence, or it can be like mutilation, or some kind of degradation. But something shifted, and sometimes it's a yearned for thing, and sometimes it's something that's being inflicted on the subject. But what does it mean? That's a good one. I guess, I mean, this sounds like such a Oprah level of watered down Buddhist stuff, but that is life. I mean, if you step back and, ask what are the properties of living material versus non-living material, the fact that living material changes is pretty central. And of course, there's all the personal experience in your human life of growing, hopefully getting better. I mean, your body stops growing at a certain point, and it's just a slow process of decay.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you like decay more than generation?
Oh no, I think they're both equally interesting, especially when they go together, right? Not to get too hairy about it, but when something's is there anything that's more not just beautiful, but there's nothing that gives me a more excited feeling than like a big log from an ancient tree, and it's crashed over in the forest, and it's covered with moss, and then the moss is covered with little ferns. The little ferns have little fungus, and there's little threads of spores coming off all of it. Or that rainforest quality of teeming decay and superabundance of life. I despise the climate in New Orleans. The hurricanes are terrifying, and I hate the heat and the humidity. But there's this super abundant quality of life where everything's constantly rotting. And, the minute a house is left alone for a few years, the roof is covered with, it's like just enveloped in vines, and then the vines have flowers all over them, and the house is just this sort of house-shaped bump underneath all this very pungent plant matter. It's really cool. I love how those things are interlocking.
Plus, the biggest bugs in the world. Down there.
Yeah. Nobody, not just the biggest bugs, but all sorts of weird, different kinds of bugs.
Yeah, it's like being in a David Cronenberg movie earlier.
Kind of, nobody prepared me for that stuff. So, I was used to the New York cockroaches, which are like medium-sized and they're really fast, I guess like New Yorkers. Yeah. And in Louisiana, they're like super huge and like insolently lazy. So you can just step on them because they're just like, oh, hey.
And they're always wearing LSU gear, too.
They might as well
purple
be.
And gold, you can see them.
And nobody told me they could fly. So I went to stop on one time, and it, like, flew at me. It was terrifying. Nobody told me there were, like, fire ants. So I sat in a fire ant, They call them ant piles, not ant hills. I sat in an ant pile and was suddenly just covered with the termite swarms.
So I should ask, what brought you to New Orleans? What keeps you there?
Well, when we were expecting my first baby, we were living in Queens. We'd been there. Let's see. I guess I'd been there about 8 years. And I've been living with my husband for about half of that. And it's not a very great place to raise a kid. It's very expensive. You're hauling strollers up and down, subway stairs. It's the school thing. It is an amazing place to be a teenager. I know, because I was a teenager in the suburbs and I'd have friends in the city and I would take the Amtrak out to visit them and just be, blisteringly jealous all the time. And I was, such a punk townie, of course. But it's not an ideal place probably to be a 6-year-old. There's not going to be any mud pies in your life, or catching lightning bugs or anything like that.
New
Orleans, my in-laws were there. I had gone there a bunch to visit. My husband's from there. And every time we'd go, I would say, I'm in love with this place. I could totally live here. And he would say, you don't know what you're saying. This place has a lot of problems. He didn't mention the bugs as one of them, but and he's right about that.
That's in the background to you at that point. Again, my wife's from rural Louisiana, so you know that stuff from childhood onwards. It doesn't seem too weird until Northerners encounter.
Yeah, and it has lots of problems that are way, way bigger than that sort of thing, of course. But it made sense, and I do love it.
Yeah,
I love it a lot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So first official book.
Yeah.
How's it feel? What was it like seeing it in print the first time?
Oh my gosh, it was great. I, had heard that artists are never happy with. I was very happy with the printing and the production. It was all. It was very, very satisfying.
Mm-hmm. And how about? Well, can you talk a little about the structure of it, as to whether you see a narrative flow to what's there and sort of how it's assembled?
Yeah, definitely. So it existed as mini comics first. I would do these pieces monthly. So come hell or high water, at the end of the month, I needed to have a piece. And as they accumulated, I'd assemble them into mini comics. I put out 3. There was material for a 4th, but I just funneled it into the book since that was already in the works at that point. So when it came time to put the book together, it was a question of how is this going to look? I could just have one giant, collection of the minis, but I really wanted there to be a bigger story. And the challenge was to kind of look at these and say, what's the story that unites them? Is there like a connective tissue that could make this one body of work? I'm sorry, I'm getting a little punny there. But, each of these for me, I realize they're not traditional comics, and they don't necessarily make a lot of sense always for the reader, that they're a little cryptic. And that's good. That's something I was going for. But for me, each of them follows like a very linear idea I had in mind when I set out to make them. And because of that, they seem like a very sequential and narrative because they fit into my world of symbology. And so in looking at them and trying to assemble a narrative structure, it did make a lot of sense. But I realized like that's all according to my own totally idiosyncratic interior sense. And it may not totally come across. And I feel okay with that. Mm-hmm. But I definitely did want to assemble them into sections and then have the sequence within each of those sections make sense, to have the sequencing of the sections make sense so that thematically it got deeper and also further away, more distant in terms of the subject matter as the book went on. And then I also wanted to use interspersed illustrations that would tell a story that kind of related to the comics, but that also existed a little bit independently and told their own story, so that it's kind of a meta comic where almost like a flip book. The images are sequential, but they're on separate pages. And then there's those anatomical illustrations, which are sequential. If they were side by side, it might count as a comic, Scott McCloud level. If they were like maybe in panels, but they're separated by whole sections of the book. So hopefully there's some concentric narratives that fit together and tell different stories that also interlock into one story.
And tell me about the symbology. How did you, when did you become aware, I guess, of some of the recurring symbols in your work, or how conscious were you initially in terms of what you were doing?
I mean, everybody, I think, has a few themes they always come back to.
Mine is just self-loathing, so I don't know what other people do to get by, but go on.
I think as an artist, you've got a few like favorite subject matters that you're always drawing. And some of that's probably just the things that it like pleases you to draw. When you're a kid, there's a few things that you can draw well, that you draw over and over, and a few things that you probably struggle to draw, and you draw them over and over, and you're never happy with that. And those almost like ruts that wheels have carved, into the road that your brain, I think, moves along over time easily. So there's certainly a few things like snakes and birds that I've always drawn a lot of, and that just interest me as animals. But there are also a few forms that I found myself going to when there was something I wanted to say and I couldn't language it very well. And sometimes I'd need to like pull on those in a deliberate way if there was an idea I was trying to get across. But it's fun when those would kind of emerge organically. I'm not someone who's like process driven. I know a lot of painters or dancers or musicians will kind of riff and, see what happens. I cannot do that. Yeah. I'm way too anxious and tight and controlled. And that absolutely plays out on the page.
It's funny because the pages seem the symbology seems as though it's all these sort of unconscious archetype things, and yet you're
I think there's a deliberate execution there. I think just whenever anything is drawn with ink and watercolor, people call it illustration automatically.
Yeah.
It looks illustration-y, but it's true. I feel like I'm definitely having an idea and then just illustrating that idea. And it almost feels like, I'm, if I'm lucky, receiving some directions and then just, following those to the best of my ability. And if the illustration is more successful, that's good. Sometimes it's not as much, but it's definitely about deliberately executing an idea. But where those come from is definitely more of an unconscious place. And when I'm lucky, it feels like something that's a as you said, more archetypal, less from me. It feels like the executive function does the artwork.
Well, I wonder if it's like Jim Woodring with the Unifactor, kind of telling him what the story is, and Jim drawing it faithfully, except for the one time he tried to do a story without the Unifactor and it drove him insane.
I remember that piece in your interview. I loved that. I feel it would be... I feel very presumptuous saying I have that kind of connection, but that's something I really strive and beg for, and I'm kind of constantly going to that headspace and groveling for directions, and sometimes I do think I get something, and other times I have to recall what it felt like to get directions and try to build the blueprint on my own. I can always tell which ones were received and which ones were built. And it's devastating to me when I would come to the end of the month and I'm like, you have nothing for me. Okay, I accept that. Let me go and, try to build the arc on my own. I like that that's part of the book too, because I think the struggle is the bumbling and the that sense of spiritual degradation when you're floundering there is a really important part of what I want to express, but it's also kind of humiliating to have to
the process
embody that and bring that across myself.
Do you have any, I would say, ritualistic approaches to this stuff?
I do.
Anything you want to share?
Okay. So
some of the stuff's intensely private for people.
Gil, running is a part of it for me, and I'm not physiologically built for running. I have...
You got 2 legs.
Yeah, well...
Only 1 arm, but still.
I have a joint condition, so that all my joints are super loose. So on a very basic level, I have a lot of problems with my ankles that cause injury if I run for more than 3 miles, more than a couple times a week. And also just because all my joints are super loose, when I run, it's like when they would show a full body shot of one of the Muppets moving around, everything. I'm just completely flopping. Yeah. And it's a very inefficient way of running. So I'm and
we'll point out there was a 30 Rock moment with that when Alec Baldwin's character says to Purcell's character, "Oh, Kenneth, to see the world through your eyes." And then you see this moment where Tina Fey's walking in, and she's a Muppet, and the limbs are just flying through the air and all that. That's all I have going through my head right now. Sorry. But
I've never seen it, but I love what I'm picturing.
Yeah, it's just 2 seconds of boom, boom, boom.
Well, that's me. So I'm huffing and puffing and hurting. And of course, it's Louisiana. So I'm, very red and sweaty. And I don't like being red or sweaty. I actually hate running, and I can't listen to music either while I'm doing it. It must be some sort of form of ascetic practice, because it really feels like this, punishing, the base material form. But somehow doing that really takes me into a headspace where I often have a lot of stuff just dumped into me. And I really hate that I have to do that in order to get that. But I feel like I've received some of the more important things that way. Meditation and prayer, of course, are another important thing, and also something I don't really like doing. It's not unpleasant, but somehow I have a really hard time doing it.
Supplicating yourself?
No, it's a lot of it's just getting my ass, down and sitting still for that long. I'm an anxious person, and just sitting still and being, and having to be with my mind at all is intensely irritating.
And yet you picked this for your passion in life, or
it.
picked you.
I think it's probably important so that it's something I wouldn't have picked. Usually stuff that I don't like is stuff that's important for me to do.
I'm an introvert and a shut-in, and yet I do this every week. So
really? Now, on what basis are you saying that?
There are degrees to which, at the end of like a long weekend like this, where I'm going to do 5 or 6 of these, I'll just stare at a wall for like 40 minutes because I'm a burned-out wreck.
What's that like? Is it pleasant afterwards? Does it feel like...
No, I mean, it charges me because it's something I talked about this summer. I went 5 weeks in between recording shows because I was so far ahead. I went into a spiral by the end of that 5-week span. I was losing my shit because I wasn't interacting with someone like this. But it's a weird thing for me. Yeah.
Oh, so you have to calibrate.
Or it's vampirism of sorts, where I basically just, have a little, touch of different people's lives and.
Is it a voyeurism thing?
I don't think so. I don't ascribe that so much as sucking your life force. I really feel it's closer to that.
Yeah.
Just being able to step into someone's world, and then leave, which is always important to me. I forget who it was. One of the guests I was talking to recently. I basically told him, I assume you guys have no object permanence. At the moment I leave the room with the mics, it's, who was that? It's just always surprises me when anyone, in fact, in the lobby today with Patrick McDonnell and his wife, Karen, I said, I'm Gil Roth. Oh my God, it's so good to see you again. I'm like, okay, they remember who I am from 3 years ago. I expected,
You make an impression.
Go figure. I think it's the fancy clothes that does it. But something I wonder about with your work, I'm just curious. Preliminary sketches, do you work things out before doing the page? Okay, because I wasn't sure how much of it is organic in that way versus
very
what you have to work out on your own.
No, it's very very deliberate. It's
we'll go back to my neuroses later, but go on.
No. I love that. No, it's very deliberate. I sketch it out. I try a couple of, ways to see what communicates best visually. God, it is just like if you got an illustration assignment, what's going to work like on a design level or communicate most clearly.
Except your art director is God?
I don't want to be too presumptuous, but that would be my hope.
But we'll say it doesn't have to be everybody else's God. But it's,
Yeah, that's about it. I do a sketch, and then I draw it with ink, and I erase out my pencils and color it in like a coloring book with watercolor or ink. Mm-hmm. There's probably a better process, but I'm not art school trained, so that's what I made up, and it worked.
Yeah, how much is self-taught for you, both in terms of comics and art? And I know, again, what you do is this hybrid style or hybrid, genre. But.
I took some art classes in college, but it wasn't my major. I kind of wish I could go back and go to art school. I think that would have been a great experience. I took art classes in high school, but where I learned the most visually is at the Art Students League, which is like sort of an educational co-op. Founded by and run by other artists in New York City. It's really cool. If you ever get a chance.
I got to go to an event there once.
It seems like this sacred space because, like Pollock and O'Keeffe and, all the important people went there, but you can just go and it's like $10 to take a figure drawing class. It's nothing. And it's super, it has this feeling of like, I think like a Zen monastery would it's just this extreme level of discipline and rigor, in terms of, and the practice, is the thing that matters there. Maybe some of the other classes are different, but all I ever took was figure drawing, life drawing, which is horrible. It's so punishing. I hate doing it.
Oh, the Chris Ware episode is going to air next week. It's all about how life drawing is the only thing that should be taught in art schools because...
Well, that's all I ever took.
That's how you learn to see.
Yeah, and the people who would occasionally... I took a class where you'd get like 5 minutes with this old man. once a week. And, he would just come around and say the same thing every time. Well, it really was like an old Zen monk thing of like, sweep, carry water or something.
Yeah.
You really just...
You didn't whack your hand with something?
Pretty much. Like, just keep doing that. And I did that a couple times a week for a few years while I was working in a bookstore in New York City. And I loathed it, but being in this space was very inspiring, and I learned a lot. Being in that environment where everybody really cared about this practice and was, submitting themselves to it in this it was like a discipleship. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but I got a whiff of that, and it was, it really kept me going through that, and I learned a lot that way. But nobody gave a toot about your, what you wanted to express, at least in the classes I took.
It was just whether you could draw or
it was,
not draw.
Just get better at drawing.
Mm-hmm. Is there another medium or form you think you would have pursued if you had more training? Or is this, again, just the what you want to do, just a question of whether you could... I would just like
to be better at it.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
I think I would have... I think I would be better if I'd gone to art school, probably. I could certainly use the computer better. Who knows?
Again, you could be like Milton Glaser. We did our show a couple of weeks ago, and it was all, I've got other people to use the computer. I tell them what to do. Someday, when you're
maybe
a super
someday.
Phenomenal designer, you'll just have a staff that you can fix that.
That would be nice.
See, that's something to aspire to.
Yeah. But no, I kind of figured out what I've got on my own, and I'm always trying to work on my own to be better. Certainly, especially with the internet, things are pretty democratic as far as the availability of tutorials and stuff like that. And I don't even have to go to a life drawing class to practice. There are apps where they just show you nude after nude on a timer, and you can...
We're going to make the chat... What was it? I forget that chat app from like 5 or 10 years ago where guys just kept sending dick pics, again and again.
I was off the dating market by then.
Oh, same here, but it was just stories you'd hear about.
I've heard things. I've never been dick picked.
Was it chat roulette or something like that? Like you'd see a different person every 15 seconds, and pretty much every man on that site would just show his junk. That was.
I have to be honest. I'm like, I accept that this is something that happens, but I'm also confused. Like, do people send pictures of erections or just their normal groin?
Off the dating pool for 15 years. So
is it like they pull out their underpants, or are they totally nude? This is weird.
And who is that actually going to appeal to?
I don't think it's meant to appeal. I think it's meant to not even provoke. My guess, based on what I know about, my experience of catcalling, is that, when you're at like a pet store or something and you want to like tap on the glass and make the rabbit like flinch, there's this sense of like, who is she to just walk by me without acknowledging me? I'm going to make, I'm going to rattle her cage. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's got to relate to that impulse.
Given that the internet has unleashed just the worst aspects that we all knew were there, but we didn't realize are quite so prevalent in mankind.
Yeah, sure.
Do you ever get you're such a nice girl, why do you draw such weird things, sort of?
Less of that. I think when I was starting out in comics, there were less people doing kind of out there stuff, and there were less women in the field. Certainly as I've gotten older, people treat young women very, very differently than any other group. I mean, I think you could say that about lots of fields and lots of different groups. It's true, but you do get a certain amount of
shitty behavior by guys,
being infantilized, or this like good for you kind of thing that's not ill-intended but doesn't land well usually.
It still be sort of condescending.
Yeah. It's probably not coming from a mean place, but it's not coming from a place of any sense of you being a person.
Yeah. Which is why I tried not to cut you off at any point that you were finishing a sentence, because I realize how incredibly insulting that is as a person.
Appreciate it.
I once, I cut off Sonny Bono's widow on a conference call once, and she was working at a lobbying firm that I was doing some work with. And,
interesting.
Yeah, and had to, I didn't have to, but I emailed her afterwards, like, I'm so sorry that I cut you off when you were in the middle of that thing. And she's like, oh, no, my God, I knew nothing about this subject, and you're ostensibly the expert, because they actually believe this. So she was happy that I cut her off. Yeah. But yeah, I still...
That's something I wondered as you were doing your AMA. And I didn't email this question, and I should have, instead of the running one, which incidentally was fascinating. I cannot imagine that being a social time. I'm often, a different universe.
For me, the great thing about running with the old men isn't just that it's social. It's that they don't give a shit about who I am.
Yeah.
They don't ask about a podcast. One of the guys has some pharma background, so we occasionally will talk a little. He'll have a question about something that I do, but otherwise, I'm just some guy, and it's such a relief not to be performing. The only performance is 9-minute miles as we do 5 miles in the morning or 13. But that's the slow pace. When we actually go on the runs, that's when things get crazy. But anyway, the thing you were going to ask me.
Wow. I was going to ask about conducting conversations. When you're doing these, you're, I guess there's two pieces to it. One is, as someone who's not natural to being social, I have to kind of monitor and try to anticipate. And there's this sense of like I'm watching interactions and trying to manage them. And when you're doing one of these, as a person who comes across who presents as being like a very naturally social, you must be engaging, in this very natural way. And yet at the same time, you are the captain of the conversation. And you must also at the same time have to be thinking about where the conversation is going, and keeping things, if not on your original track, on a track that's going to work for a podcast, and also make sure you're making the other person comfortable and be thinking about all these other things.
Oh, I'm sorry. I lost you. I'm just kidding. No, it's all true. There's parts of it that, and it depends on the guest, depends on the mood I'm in and how the day job is going and all that stuff. I've used this line before. There are times I feel like I would fail a Turing test, that, I feel as though I'm faking what it means to be a human being. And as such, some of these episodes are almost like me trying to reverse engineer what it's like to be people. And to figure, I know there are aspects of this that are deeply, deeply messed up. But when I get into a conversation and really lose myself in it, it's wonderful. When I get surprised by the other person and we can start interacting, not just with, zingers, et cetera, but really learning something about the other person or hearing them learning something about themselves in the process. To me, that's really rewarding. But there are moments where I'm not formulating, but you'll say something. Again, the symbology question, when that came up, I didn't have an exact term for it when I was writing up questions, and that was the moment of, let's get back to the symbology and figure out where that goes. There are also instances where certain people have just speech patterns, or they might be a little older and have some dementia-related issues, or just repeat stories in certain ways, or tell stories that I know they've told in 10 different interviews before. And
they've got you on autopilot.
Yeah, and I have to figure out how to, oh God, they're going to hear the same thing. Now, the great story I have behind this was Cliff Nestoroff, the historian of comedy, who I listened to about 4 or 5 different podcast interviews with him, and he told the same stories one after another. And I went into that one specifically, I had everything worked out to derail him from any of those stories. And he was getting he didn't know I was doing this. And he was getting more and more infuriated that he couldn't get these leads that he would always launch into his stories with. And his friend who introduced us was ecstatic when he listened to it. He's like, it's so great. You kept him from telling any of those stories. You got him to talk about all this other stuff. I think he had one bit, but everything else he had to really think about what he was saying instead of falling back on things he had.
Yeah, how he screwed up his delivery.
Oh, it was tremendous. I felt so good because I knew, I'm like, I know what he's asking me right now, and I know if I feed this back to him, he's going to go to X. So I'm going to short circuit that and go somewhere else. So some of that, chess match goes on, but generally it's organic. I do the work beforehand as best I can, but there's a degree to which, again, I feel like I'm reverse engineering human behavior for myself, so I can feel like a person for a while.
Oh, this is cool, though. That kind of goes back to what you were saying about transformation, and I was saying, you're at a certain point you're just decaying, and then working on yourself and growing becomes, a much more important task all of a sudden. That you can only remediate the parts of you that are missing so much, and at a certain point it's kind of about where can you grow your existing tissue into those gaps and use what you have of who you are to kind of fill in those spaces. So that's really cool.
I do think there's degrees to which this has, I've developed a great deal of empathy and understanding of human beings through this stuff because I have to learn to read people's faces and understand their changes of tone and things like that in really, really granular ways. Because occasionally there'll be a question that I either just goes wrong or just the tone of it I misdeliver. Or you need to figure out what the other person's saying versus what they mean. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's been a pretty educational thing for me, but I treat it as though it's reverse therapy. Like I'm the one who's actually benefiting from this, but none of you guys have to know that. So I'm giving away all my secrets here, but it's okay. No one listens, so it's all right.
I love this. I love this.
Tell me about the tarot.
Oh, I started seeing someone to receive Reiki. And I do so many things that are super woo-woo, and I don't even believe them. I don't. But see,
I didn't give any betrayal of saying, "Oh God, she's one of those Oprah self-help people."
I do them.
Are you Goop?
Are
you the Gwyneth Paltrow type thing? With
Goop. That's the
vaginal jade egg and all that stuff.
I haven't, but I'm.
I didn't mean to bring that up. If it's a sore subject, as it were. But,
I have read about that one. Yeah.
So you're not that crazy, but you're getting Reiki.
I'm telling you, we moved to California when I was a little kid, and as soon as I got like a whiff of patchouli, and I was just like, I love this. There was this store near me called Alexandria 2, and I would take my allowance money and walk like 2 miles to get there, and they had like all these, ancient aliens, CDs and, crystals and, mood rings. And I spent all my allowance money on that shit. I loved that stuff. And I didn't believe it, but somehow it really resonated with me. I love that kind of stuff.
What religion did you have growing up?
Episcopalian.
Okay.
So it's... someone said to me, Catholic light, all the dogma, half the guilt. But it is kind of missing the pageantry and...
That's what I was wondering. Because Catholicism sounds as though it's the...
I'm definitely drawn to that stuff where it's formal and... rich, and there's the piece of mysticism where there's a sense that there's another world just below the surface of this, and that everything is teeming with a enchanted form of reality that's a deeper than this.
Yeah.
And I realize I appreciate how out there that sounds. And I'm willing to accept that it may, is possibly completely false, but it feels Just like, all that, ancient alien pyramid stuff. Yeah. I get that that's not necessarily like factually truthful, but it resonates with a deeper...
It adds a layer of meaning.
It feels right, even if it's not true. And ultimately, it's more important for me to have that experience of truth than it is to be correct. So I'm going with that. So I'm sorry, what was your question that got me? Tarot. Yeah. So I saw this friend for Reiki, and he's like, now, I don't believe in, didn't believe in Reiki myself coming to it, but it works. I guess that's the thing. All that stuff may be false, but it works, and it gives me what I'm looking for. So I'm absolutely all in to believing it, 100%. And, he said, I'm going to pull out some tarot cards, what do you think? I'm like, try anything once. And I, partly maybe because the deck is so incredibly beautiful. I use I think it's Rider-Waite. I'm probably saying that wrong. Deck. It's gorgeous. That really, strikes a chord for me. Those, beautiful, very classical illustrations. And I think it's just probably a Jungian thing. There's always something there that, what could this mean for you in this moment? Maybe it's just a Rorschach, but I loved that. So when I was drawing The Disciple, which I have not worked on in many years, it may be dead in the water, I don't know, but I was pulling those major arcana cards and using those as source imagery for where this poor spiritual devotee was going to be headed.
Mm-hmm. So I just used the Brian Eno oblique strategies cards because I'm solely verbal. I don't have any visual imagination whatsoever. Except everyone I drew just kept saying, sit down and get back to work. And that was pretty much it for me. No, there are all sorts of neat ones that just give you these weird suggestions as a starting point. But nothing ever actually leads to me making art if you don't consider this to be
Has it ever played into this in any way?
No. It's always when I keep it on my analog table. I have a table in my library that has nothing digital. And so I just, scribble in a journal and pretend I'm going to write something of real significance. But
are you a physical books person? Because I noticed that you said you needed to transcribe from the iPad to a notepad.
Yeah.
And I was, wondering, why is it better to write versus type on the iPad?
It's good to write the questions up on the pad, but just having things written down on a piece of paper. That way I can, scribble more notes as we're talking. If you saw a screen shining up at my face right now.
Because I feel like that would, but it's, it's a little arbitrary. Someone was saying that they went to a funeral and the priest was having to pull up the text he needed to read on his phone. And they're like, fundamentally, that's not different than a little book, but it felt different.
It is. And when I pitched Chris Ware, I guess 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago. Pete Bagg introduced us here and you got to do Gil's podcast. And it's like, I live in Chicago. Can you do this by phone or Skype? And I said to him, Chris, this is actually an hour plus of two people sitting at a table, not looking at screens and just looking at each other's faces. And the smile just kept getting bigger and bigger on his face. Like, oh, you get it. Okay.
For most people, that would have been like, oh man, how many, a real,
but the idea that there's an unmediated experience, though, the idea that it's just, even when the guest just kind of looks off or won't look at me, which happens sometimes, because some people just, I don't know if it's like that Marina Abramovic or whatever her name is, the a Croatian artist who had that thing at the museum where she would just sit still for 6 hours and people had to sit down and stare at her until they cried. Yeah. I hope I don't make people cry, but afterwards. But again, they forget who I am. But anyway,
bringing that total unmediated quality of presence.
I just figure, people don't talk to each other. People are always talking to screens. They're always, typing or texting or something. And,
You say that as someone who makes media.
Yeah, I'd like to well, one of my guests pitched another guest, and he told the guy, like, this isn't sound bites. He's going to let you talk.
Yeah.
Just, you get an hour. And we ended up having one of the great emotional moments of the show. And
You made him cry.
No, but he told me stories that he just had never talked about because no one had ever asked him. Because nobody had an hour plus conversation with the guy about something.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Freaking out around your idols, your cartooning idols?
Oh, I totally do that.
Yeah. Have you gotten better at it yet, or no?
I have not really made the effort. I'm absolutely like uninhibited about just gushing to people, and I've come to appreciate that might be off-putting. So I guess I've started to try to tone it down a little. But I mean, why? I feel like only because it might bother that person, but I feel like most of the time the impulse to control that comes from the sense of, oh, well, I won't be cool if I'm some, hyperventilating fan person. But I don't care for that idea. I'm not going to be too cool to be excited. That's ridiculous. And this is probably a little bit of that same, vein of autistic way of experiencing the world. But for me, being like deeply interested in something and just going intensely into that, whether that's, telling stories about it or experiencing that, alongside someone in a parallel play sort of way, or, enthusing over it in a perseveratory way. That to me is the best experience. And if I have the opportunity to just, gush about something or talk to, why am I going to hold back about something like that? I'd be denying myself one of the great pleasures I have in life, which is, unbridled curiosity and enthusiasm about specific subjects. And especially when you get to meet someone and share about that. I guess I've become more aware of not wanting to make that person perform a service to me and receive a bunch of associations I have about the work. I try to, give something that's going to be fun for that person, but I do not tone it down at all. And I guess I don't make myself look very good in the process. But you know what? If someone's going to think less of me because their work did what it was supposed to for me, that's, just too bad.
Has anyone freaked out around you over your...
a couple of people have.
Yeah.
It was so pleasant, to feel like that was successful. They don't have to like me or like the work, but to feel like it did what, I did a good job on those directions.
Yeah, do you remember the first person you didn't know coming to you and saying, that comic you did?
Probably my first or second show. I get lots of mixed reactions.
Yeah.
I think my favorite was this woman walked past my table, and as she was looking, she looked over and just went, kept on walking.
I don't know if I should be turned on or repulsed. I have no idea. Yeah. Is that
the ambivalence or the attraction repulsion is a big response that people have expressed, whether they like the work or not, and that's a cool that's a cool response. That's something that I like that feeling. I like that feeling when something's draws me, yet is hard to bring myself to approach. And also when something's, very gorgeous, and at the same time has like a little with foulness to it.
I prefer air of menace, but yeah.
Oh, that works too. Yeah. Something that's very sweet and pure and elevated, and also has just this little bit of awfulness present as well. Yeah.
Are you going to be sticking with this vein of work, as it were, or are you looking at other types of storytelling?
I'm definitely going to be leaving this. I mean, that disappoints me, because I finally found something that feels pretty natural. It feels like I worked out a system that expresses the idea in a way that works fairly well. And that I've kind of come to understand what these are and have gotten better at them. And I, at the same time, feel like I've gotten this like most unwelcome intuition that this has run its course and I need to take on something else. And I'm going to just like have to start from scratch, building a new system for expressing those ideas. And I'm not pleased. It's just not, it's like the figure drawing or the running. This is not, I'm very, very willing. I will absolutely submit to this, but it's not going to be easy. I don't have a lot of time in my day to screw up. You know what I mean? I only have, just for practical reasons of my lifestyle, I only have a couple of hours a week to draw. The nice thing with these is, I could sit down and use each of those hours to work on a finished piece. Starting over is going to mean a lot of exploring and experimenting and being willing to throw everything away and start over if that's what the story demands. And, if God tells me to throw everything away when I'm almost done, I'm going to do it. But
again, you could end up like Woodring, do an entire book, and then realize the Unifactor did not want you to do that book, and go back and revise and make a second book that sends it off in another direction.
I mean, I don't know that many other people out there in the world are going, God dog it, Uncle Jim, this book shouldn't exist. It's out there and probably pretty palatable to most, but
it speaks to him in a different way.
So I'm going to be heading back towards more traditional storytelling, which is going to mean like learning how to do that, inventing a visual language for what I want to say, getting better at drawing figures. And drawing in general and designing a page, because this work's going to need to be more beautiful. And also, doing all of that, and also figuring out kind of what I can get away with. I don't think I'll ever be able to leave the body horror themes behind. I think that's a really apt phrase for what strikes a nerve for me, but I don't think it's necessarily horror work either. But
the body grotesquerie has too many symbols, too many syllables. So I think grotesquerie, the chimera obscura, the chimera, the combination of like disparate and incongruous elements together. I think that's something that, for me, the pieces that struggle and don't want to be together, whether it's the unconscious imagery and then the super tight anxious drawing style, or the beauty and foulness forced together. I think that's just not something I'm ever going to be able to get away from, even if I wanted to. And I know I'm going to bring that to any project that I do.
I just need to make sure I'm doing it in a way that stays fresh.
Yeah, how tough is it for you to tone down that stuff for like illustration work, to just do things that are representative?
I'm a hack.
Yeah, like, how do you just shut off that part? Just, this is the hand. The hand is going to do this now. And
I do not have, possibly because I don't feel like it was me creating the good stuff, and partly because I'm, an anxious, pleaser. I can just turn that same machination over and say, to a client, like, what have you got for me? I will slavishly execute it according to your terms.
And then take the money so you can go off and make...
That's the idea. Yeah. I just did some illustrations for a museum, which was really fun for me. Yeah. I love museums.
And you have the Pharmacy Museum that you did the book out of.
We do.
New Orleans.
And I just did one for, you would actually love it, Gil, the Sazerac Museum, which is opening this very weekend. Nice. So it's all dedicated to the history of cocktails, spirits, and all of that. And it's very debonair, the way they've put it together.
We'll be down in Christmas time visiting Amy's family, so we'll have to get away from them and come into the city.
Slip away. That would be a definite break from the in-laws kind of excursion.
Especially because, they don't drink. But neither do I, but still.
Neither do mine. Oh, yeah, that's right. You don't. Well, that's totally inappropriate for me to have suggested.
It's only because of my because you figure
like
it's because I'm debonair. I actually have the fancy jacket in the closet here too, because I figure somebody needs to show up the rest of these comics people. That's as you always
count on you.
Yeah, well, again, I'm not in comics, so I can afford to dress a little bit better. I figure that's how it works. Let me ask you: you did journal comics, like a 5-day journal comic for the Comics Journal.
That was weird.
Was it more uncomfortable for you to do stories about your own life and your family, or to do panel by panel continuity? Like, what was it, the actual form of doing comics like that was?
It was a good exercise. I've done panel by panel comics before. In fact, I have one coming out probably around now for now. Eric Reynolds, work from Fanta. I just love that series because it feels like going and picking up those floppies, that exposed me to comics in the 90s, where you could, very low stakes, see a whole bunch of like disparate weird stuff that was new to you. So it's a real...
I think 00 was the one they used to do back in the 90s.
Yeah. But I have a piece in there that's sequential. It's panels per page. I take that back. It ends in a weird way.
I'll have to look forward here at the festival.
But that was weird to get back to. But it was mostly just. It was awkward to
do family stuff.
Or to do family stuff. I try to keep myself out of the lens as much as possible, and part of it is because I feel not to be too presumptuous, but I feel like at best, at my luckiest moments, I'm called to do something that's transpersonal, and so to put my
persona.
To put my, little ego and my rinky-dink little life on the page feels weird.
But it's funny because you came up with 90s comics, and so much of that was the autobio genre.
That's the voyeuristic thing.
Really?
I think
so you love looking into people's lives, but not I think you don't have an awful lot in common, frankly. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's I love seeing... and getting that window into other people's lives. How do you be a person? Even if, it's spectacularly,
mundane.
If
it's
not
still
mundane,
functional.
or if it's dysfunctional. I love that. Yeah. But it was weird putting me, I tried to keep my kids out of it for the most part, but they take up most of my day. I have a day job, but, most of my discretionary time involves them in some way. I didn't want to draw myself very much because I'm like too vain to draw myself ugly, and too, embarrassed to draw myself good looking. So it was a lot of point of view shots.
You should have come up with a completely cartoonish view of yourself in a relatively realist setting and just thrown this like absurd, cartoony version.
Totally. Like or very minimal, like a, play school figure.
Yeah.
Kind of
I just did the Sylvia Nickerson episode just went up a couple of days ago, and her first book is Everybody is Shapeless, or Everybody's Formless. They're just, the sort of shapes of people. There's no detail or anything. I mean, you get larger and smaller, mother and child, but it's just the backgrounds in the city that has distinct detail. It's kind of a neat trick to use.
Yeah.
But you did include the body horror thing because you actually used a neti pot with tap water in Louisiana, which is a sure way to get brain amoebas and die.
As my Reiki friend, told me, I guess on some level I knew that, but I needed someone to remind me, like,
you're playing Russian roulette with a neti pot,
yeah. And ever since then, if I'm in the shower and I get a little like sniff of water up my nose, I remember how he said multiple people have, died from that. It's,
in Louisiana. It's not like it's a nationwide. It's one place.
Right. It really is the third world. I mean, I lived in Ecuador for a few months and, brownouts and, contaminated water and stuff in the cities was, just routine. And it's the same there for sure. You really can't expect much in the way of infrastructure. Yeah, I
went one semester at Tulane before I left because I wasn't drinking back then either. I made up for it in between, but their whole thing was, don't drink the water. You have to get the bottled water. This is 1989, and it was just don't. And the shower's okay, but just don't take in too much.
We drink the tap water. Yeah. I guess I've got to think about getting a filter.
Again, mutation and weird growths. That's be fitting right in with the comics. You'd be okay. So for the next thing you're working on, it's just a departure, but something you don't want to talk about too much because you're still figuring it out.
I'm still figuring it out, but I could say the subject. I've started, although I don't heavily advertise a Patreon, just to
I'll mention it during the intro anyway, but yeah.
Thank you. It's I just want to keep that accountability for myself, and I'm hopeful that people who subscribe are open to seeing a lot of experimentation and flailing around as I try to figure out the pieces.
And dick drawings this week.
Oh, so that was good. Plenty of those. Yeah. Eventually I'll be able to serialize, hey, you guys get to see the pages before they're published. But at this point, I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to convey this. It seems like a stupid thing to take on because this is going to be box office poison. The subject is the Song of Solomon, which is an erotic book of poetry in the Bible. And the inspiration of one of the great lines from my favorite movie, Miller's Crossing, where Gabriel Byrne says, if I knew we were going to cast our feelings into words, I'd have memorized the Song of Solomon. And Marcia Gay Harden doesn't take it well. But anyway, yeah. Yeah, but that's all it is. It's just two lovers calling out to one another about their desire. And that's, there's no directions for living your life. There's no lessons about the nature of God or, stories about, God's people. It's no tribes getting massacred or anything. It's just these two lovers, just breathlessly calling out and describing this very rich imagery from the Holy Land of very sensual imagery about plants and animals and foods and tents and chariots and things like that. And it's and some of the wording's pretty steamy and pretty dirty. And others of it is a parallel to that need to just like throw yourself off a cliff in the like the devotional impulse. So I want to adapt that for comics and have it be an hardcore erotic body horror book. And it seems like, why do I need to do this? It's going to be too holy for anyone who wants
piss off
to
these
see
people or those people.
Yeah, and it's going to turn off all the demographics. But it seems like something I really I have to try to follow that assignment to the best of my abilities. And it seems terrible, Gil, because this is not something I want to. It's not something where I want to fall short at. Mm-hmm. It seems like because of the quality of the material and the level at which the level of stuff is expressing, it's not something where you can do less than dare greatly. It's not something, the stakes feel really high.
Yeah.
This is everything you don't want as an artist.
Crumb did the Book of Genesis.
He did.
I know he's a different situation.
This is a different situation.
But it's still.
He's a master of the form. I don't feel like he probably had a huge dog in the fight emotionally, probably.
He's a very profane person covering a very sacred subject.
Well, and I'm going to bring this, you're going
to be crisscrossing those.
I'm going to bring this deep, level of raunch that's going to be hopefully not blasphemous, but probably read that way to this project. It's no, I'm not going to be bringing any level of drawing mastery and defined language to it. It's, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Gil. It's been a fascinating conversation and a huge pleasure.
I should ask, last question you'd want to ask me.
Shoot, I wish I had something more up my sleeve now. Has there been a time you noticed in a conversation you were going spectacularly off the rails?
Yeah.
And
sorry. Go on.
You don't have to name the person, but what was it like trying to reel that in? Were you able to take control again?
For my own going off the rails or the guest?
Oh, either one. Whatever you feel like talking about.
Because this past Monday, in fact, it was non-podcast. I was giving a presentation at the 6:30 at night at a conference where everybody is burned out and tired. They had no energy. I was flailing, couldn't make the conversation, make the presentation work. I just didn't have it. And this is all my pharmaceutical stuff. But we had time for one question, and it was an Indian guy with a sort of high-pitched voice, and he had the microphone right up to his mouth, and he talked for a full minute because I had the timer sitting there for my session. I couldn't understand a word he was saying.
That's a long time.
And I couldn't understand anything he was saying. And all that was going through my head was at some point he's going to stop talking, and that's when I have to say something. And I literally don't know what he's asking right now. So I looked over to the MC and said, "I'm sorry, I'm getting some weird feedback up here." When the guy stopped, and he repeated the question, and I was able to give him a response. But
you were lucky that MC wasn't like, "You son of a bitch." Oh, yeah. I was counting on you to
somebody
understand
has to know
this.
What he said. I was once on a panel.
Who's he going to punt it to?
Oh, that's the thing. It turned to the rest of the audience. Does anybody know what he said? I was once on a panel where an elderly Japanese guy gets up in the audience for Q&A, and all I'm thinking is, "Don't ask me, don't ask me, don't ask me." And this question is for Mr. Roth. And I'm like, but, he asked a question. I ended up understanding what he said, and we've become good pals since then, of all things. And it's going to lead to my first trip to Japan next year, probably. It's real strange.
Cool.
My day job has some weird crenellations to it.
Yeah.
In fact, it's something something I've run into. This guy has introduced me to a number of Japanese companies.
And they bring gifts
yes.
for meetings. I'm so unaccustomed to that.
It's very important. I've been there. My grandparents lived there when I was a kid.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. So my grandfather was actually working there. So the gifts was a whole...
Yeah. The problem is, like, these companies, they escalate.
Yes.
Gifts.
Oh, yes.
They're real good, and it's one of those I'm just some guy from New Jersey. Like with each other, it's just exchanging little Bed Bath and Beyond kit
totally.
or something. With me, it's
Oh yeah.
So eventually,
there's this one, and maybe this is a whole thing, but they took me to one place where it's a store, it's a whole tower. It's like, Bergdorf, I don't know, something where it's very high-end and very storied establishment that's been around forever. And on the first floor, they sell, handkerchiefs. And on the second floor, it's like fancy pens. And on the third floor, it's like, Rolex. Like it escalates, as you go up to the top floor based on who you're, how low you're going to be bowing for this person.
Well, did you ever read the...
And all these things are useless.
Oh, yeah.
Useless
but it's
shit.
all tokens of or symbols of something. Alan Moore did a comic in Raw around early 90s. Mark Beyer illustrated it about a bowing machine.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever read it. And
do.
The guy has a dream where he meets God, and God hands him a blank business card, and that's a sign of God's status, because the card just has less and less information. It's blank, therefore he's God. So, because comics can always be our term of currency, I guess. But yeah, within episodes, there are times if I'm rambling, I'll recognize, I'll figure out how to end this with a pause so that I can edit this out later on, and just try and figure out one good question to toss back to the guest. There are I used to be worse about it. Some guests I would let go when they were just rambling. Now I've gotten a lot better at, but
without interrupting, of course.
Yeah, but figuring out a way to interrupt them or at least cut them off of that line of rambling on forever. There are 3 or 4 episodes that will never air because guests were just in their own world and did their own thing.
Ooh.
There's also one that'll never air because the guest contacted me a day later and said, don't air it, and never responded again when I asked her why. I'll tell you that story later on. But
Ooh.
It's a weird one.
Is it one where you were like, no, this is so good and so out there? So or you're like, yeah, that was a good call. That
it wasn't bad, but what irked me was that I'd spent 2 weeks reading this person's books, and we did 2.5 hours of recording, and like an hour and a half into the city and out. And so it was just the time investment. That pissed me off. Yeah. But otherwise, I've made up for it, and I'm in this run of double episodes lately, so I'm going to...
I appreciate you taking me on early in the CXC lineup. Not necessarily because I think I'm getting a fresher, better gill.
No, I'm wiped out and exhausted today, and I'm amazed that I'm conducting this one as well as I am.
I think we just think that the other person's doing well. I only slept 3 hours last night. Yeah. My brain is just like a backed up garbage disposal. Like, hopefully interesting stuff has been coming to the surface, but it's
sheer exhaustion and sleep deprivation.
Mess in here.
But no one has to know. They'll just see this wonderful conversation, and they'll think we were charming and well rested.
I think it's going to be like that bit in Dirty Harry, where both the villain and the hero are like grievously injured, and they're trying to fight, but they're both like severely compromised. Yeah.
But the CXC thing does bring up the question. Best practices for festivals and cons?
Oh, I have a bunch, but those probably relate to being a tabler.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, tell me what have you learned over the years of doing this stuff?
Going into the vein of woo-woo, in order to have some sort of sense of agency over my anxiety, there's a little bit of like magical thinking that goes into this. So I visited the Voodoo Botanica in New Orleans and purchased a bunch of like trinkets and powders and oils that are supposed to set me up for auspicious interactions, including one that at cake, I was like, I'm just going to burn a tiny bit of paleo Santa, it'll be fine. I'm here before everyone. No one will notice. And
I thought you were going to like stink up your Airbnb.
No. I was like, I could, do the space. I had a little bell. I'm like ringing it really quietly. And then I was like, I'll just light this for a second. No one will notice. And, Jack Cohen was like at a table, was next to me, and she's like, I got to tell maybe I should tell the volunteers, that I think something might be burning. And I was like, oh Lord, I have to, I played dumb for a minute, and then I was like, I can't have them, investigate. I had to own up. I felt like such a jackass.
Well, you have to assume Jack, being the publicity director for Fanta, has experienced some weird artist behavior. Yeah, she's
seen some stuff.
Weirder shit than you. That's.
Oh, that's that makes me feel good.
Yeah. You're still pretty weird. Don't get me wrong. But.
I don't feel one-upped. I'm totally willing to accept that, and in my job life and in my, Peyton Place, picket fence suburbs life, it is very, very square, and I'm very comfortable with that. Coming to shows is, like you said, stepping away from your usual identity. I get to, hopefully I'm not too over the top, but get to inhabit this weird part of my personality. And it's very enjoyable. It's not something I get to access on a day-to-day kind of basis. But as far as like managing the shows, you don't want to be that person eating a bowl of pho behind your table. I always get one of those like kefir bottles, and that is the correct balance of like liquid food and protein, and you can, chug-a-lug that and not have to be slobby eating behind your table, or else be, gone from your table, or passed out, or, getting cranky. What else is important? Comfortable shoes. And what else is important?
Fan interaction. How do you... What have you learned about interacting with people who actually know your work, as opposed to like the person who has never seen
it? Because selling it to passersby is always a little weird.
You may not want to open this book, but you
may. Right, and I really hate turning away people's kids who come to the table, but there's definitely no, even in my minis, anything child appropriate. And as someone who has a family, I feel like I'm, being a little like... Get out of here. I'll be like, no, I get it. My kids can't see it either. But I love inviting, people's responses. But yeah, trying to come up with a little bit of an elevator pitch for each of them has been a little weird, because they're non-traditional. What else is important for shows? You've got to self-regulate and take that 5 minutes to stare at the wall, like you were saying, after a bunch of interaction, or at least I sure do. I kind of wish I could install like a nap pod under my table, where I could just withdraw and do a little sensory deprivation. What else matters at shows? Stay hydrated. You got to titrate like the right amount of like CBD drops versus coffee. If you go too far one way, that's bad, and too far the other way.
And making time to see artists you like?
I do. I don't tend to have a table mate, and I've gotten over that like fear of missing out, and just, walk around and meet people and see the people that you care about, and try to discover some new stuff. I don't make it to panels. I always regret that. But seeing people face to face definitely wins out as far as when I'm willing to walk away from my stuff.
And sitting down with some schlub from New Jersey and a couple of microphones. Kate, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And that was Kate Lacour. Her new book is Vivisectionary from Fantagraphics. It's disturbing and weird and unlike just about any comics you've ever read, which means I highly recommend it. But keep it away from little kids, okay? Now, Kate's site, which has a ton of her work, including comics, prints, body art, some of the sequential work she's done, and plenty more, is katelacour.com, which is KATELACOUR.com. She's on Instagram as Kate Lacour Art, all one word, and on Twitter as Kate Lacour. She also has a Patreon at patreon.com/Kate Lacour, all one word, and she is the sort of artist who deserves support from that platform. So kick in some money for her, maybe some for her peers. They all deserve it more than I do. And after we wrapped, I asked Kate, so, who you been reading? And of course, that was as strange as all the other stuff that we talked about. If you want to hear her answer to that and get a ton of extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get the third quarter 2019 episode up later in October, maybe early November, just because, well, I mentioned at the top, anxiety about some day job stuff, including my big conference coming up in the middle of the month. Anyway, the second quarter 2019 episode features an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Mark Allen Stamety, David Shields, Michael Carroll, Frederick Tutton, Ursi Soteropoulos, Caitlin Foisey, Seth, Nina Bunjevac, Stephen Guarnacha, Hugh Ryan, Bill Griffith, Boris Fishman, and Barbara Nessim. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, which I've started doing more and more posts about, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which I will also get to later, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one during Cartoon Crossroads Columbus weekend, or CXC, in September. I'm going to break it down for you. Hotel was $560 for the 2 nights. Airfare was $550, and parking at Newark was $100 or so. I also spent a little money on coffee and a couple of meals, although I also ate with cartoonists, publishers who helped pay the bills a little bit. Plus, I took a lift out to Ray Ray's Hog Pit and back on Saturday for late lunch. So figure like $1,300 or so for the weekend. Now, I got 5 podcasts in from Friday afternoon to Sunday, as well as just some fun conversations with people like Patrick McDonnell, who I mentioned at the beginning. So it works out to a decent rate. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, and coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Vebe, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.